evening, I'm Gwen Eiffel. Jim Lara is away. On the NewsHour tonight, a summary of today's news, a look at the reaction to President Bush's economic proposals, plus his ideas for expanding the war on terrorism, and a Richard Rodriguez essay about the power of memory.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lara has been provided by...
Imagine a world where we're not diminishing resources, we're growing them. Ethanol, a cleaner burning fuel, made from corn. ADM, the nature of what's to come.
And by SBC Communications. In the last year alone, SBC employees volunteered more than 6 million hours, which means even when we're not working to improve communications, we're doing something to help improve communities. SBC Communications.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This program was also made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Bush took his State of the Union message on the road today. In Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he said again, the United States is in the midst of two great struggles, with terrorism and with recession. He said the military is pursuing the nation's enemies and that Congress should act to create jobs and leave the tax cuts in place.
The best way to help an economy recover is to let hard-working people keep more of their money. When they get more money in their pocket, they spend more money, and as they spend more money, it helps create jobs. Tax relief is an important way to battle recession, and for those who want to do away with tax relief, you don't know what you're talking about.
The president will be in Florida and Georgia tomorrow. The Federal Reserve today left the key interest rate unchanged at a 40-year low. That ended a year-long string of rate cuts. A Fed statement said, despite risks to the recovery, economic activity is beginning to firm. And the Commerce Department reported today the economy expanded in the fourth quarter last year. The growth rate was 0.2%, much better than expected. A White House spokesman today played down talk of military strikes against Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Last night, President Bush said they form an axis of evil, developing weapons of mass destruction and aiding terrorists, and he vowed to do something about it. Today, the spokesman said the president did not mean to signal military action was imminent. The U.S. military confirmed today it's investigating whether American troops mistakenly killed friendly fighters in Afghanistan last week. Special forces raided a site north of Kandahar, killing at least 15 people and arresting 27. Local leaders now say anti-Taliban fighters were the victims. They say the U.S. military was given bad intelligence. At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said there's no evidence those claims are true, but he also said shifting loyalties in Afghanistan complicate things.
It is perfectly possible to go in a situation, get shot at, shoot back, and end up having someone say that those people were Taliban, and somebody else say that those people were people we were engaging in our local government. And both can be true in as confused a situation as it is in village after village in Afghanistan.
The investigation should be completed in about 2 weeks. In Pakistan today, police said they detained 2 men who had been senior Taliban officials. They were the former Chief Justice and the Deputy Foreign Minister. Afghanistan's interim leader Hamid Karzai addressed the UN Security Council today. He called for enlarging the peacekeeping force in his country. Currently, it's limited to a maximum of 5,000 troops, restricted to Kabul. Earlier, Karzai toured the site of the World Trade Center with New York Governor George Pataki. He laid a wreath and said Afghans suffered at the hands of the same people who planned September 11th.
While the Afghans are too sad, as sad as the Americans, they're grateful to the American people for making us win our war against terrorism. And we will continue to do that till we have finished them all and put them on trial. I want the people in New York to see the faces of those people on trial, on TVs, and to see that they receive justice. That we will do. That's a promise, and we will deliver on that.
Karzai will address the World Economic Forum tomorrow in New York. Pakistani militants reportedly threatened today to kill a Wall Street Journal reporter. Daniel Pearl disappeared in Karachi a week ago, and a militant group later said it had kidnapped him. Today, news organizations received an email in the name of that group. It said, "We will execute him within 24 hours unless America fulfills our demands for better treatment of Afghan war captives." It also warned other U.S. journalists to leave Pakistan within 3 days. Hours earlier, Pakistani police arrested a Muslim cleric Pearl had been trying to interview. A congressional watchdog agency will sue to get documents from Vice President Cheney's Energy Task Force. The General Accounting Office formally announced that today. It wants the records of task force meetings with Enron and other companies. The president and vice president have said they should not have to disclose confidential advice on policy. Vice President Cheney's office confirmed today he received a 3-page memo last April from Kenneth Lay, then the chairman of Enron. The memo urged federal regulators not to impose price caps on electricity in California. An advisor to the vice president said most of Enron's ideas never made it into the administration's energy policy. A videotape surfaced today showing Kenneth Lay apologizing to Enron workers last October. NBC aired the video of a company staff meeting. In it, Lay said he was heartbroken that many workers lost their wealth as the company's finances collapsed. He read aloud this question from an angry employee.
I would like to know if you are on crack. If so, that would explain a lot. If not, you may want to start because it's going to be a long time before we trust you again. I think that's probably not a very happy employee, and that's understandable.
On the video, Lay also told the workers he was sorry and promised to retrieve the money they lost. Last week, he resigned as chairman and CEO. Parts of San Francisco International Airport were shut down for several hours today, and thousands of passengers were evacuated. It happened after a screening test detected the residue of explosives on a passenger's shoes. He disappeared into the crowd, and a search failed to find him. An airport spokesman said the residue could have been anything from traces of fireworks to nitroglycerin tablets. That's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to the politics of the economy, fighting terrorism, and a Richard Rodriguez essay. First, doing the numbers on the State of the Union. Kwame Holman begins.
In keeping with long-standing tradition, many of the dignitaries attending the State of the Union address enter and exit the House chamber through the Capitol's grand statuary hall. And shortly after 10 of members of Congress engaged in another statuary hall tradition, providing instant reaction to what the president had just said.
I thought he nailed it.
He hit all the right notes.
I thought it was a great speech. He was very articulate.
He now transcends politics.
Well, it's a fantastic, well-written speech.
That bipartisan praise was directed especially at the first third of President Bush's address, which was dominated by forceful words about the U.S. campaign against terrorism and the cost of keeping that effort going.
It costs a lot to fight this war. We have spent more than $1 billion a month, over $30 million a day, and we must be prepared for future operations. Afghanistan proved that expensive precision weapons defeat the enemy and spare innocent lives, and we need more of them. We need to replace aging aircraft and make our military more agile to put our troops anywhere in the world quickly and safely. Our men and women in uniform deserve the best weapons, the best equipment, the best training, and they also deserve another pay raise. My budget includes the largest increase in defense spending in 2 decades, because while the price of freedom and security is high, it is never too high. Whatever it costs to defend our country, we will pay.
But for months, members of Congress have watched with alarm as the terror attacks and their aftermath, coupled with recession, erased projected surpluses from the federal budget. North Carolina Democrat Mel Watt.
We worked so hard over the last 8 to 10 years to get back into a surplus situation,
And now this president has been in office about a year, and we're back in a deficit situation with no end in sight.
And many members were uneasy last night as the president went on to tick off other major spending initiatives he wants enacted, including a $38 billion Homeland Security offensive.
The next priority in my budget is to do everything possible to protect our citizens and strengthen our nation against the ongoing threat of another attack. Time and distance from the events of September the 11th will not make us safer unless we act on its lessons. America is no longer protected by vast oceans. Protected from attack only by vigorous action abroad and increased vigilance at home. My budget nearly doubles funding for a sustained strategy of homeland security focused on 4 key areas: bioterrorism, emergency response, airport and border security, and improved intelligence.
The president also called for adding a prescription drug benefit for low-income seniors, making last spring's income tax cuts permanent, and an economic stimulus package of benefits for the unemployed and tax cuts for businesses.
Once we have funded our national security and our homeland security, the final great priority of my budget is economic security for the American people.
But Mr. Bush made clear the burden of paying for the new programs without overspending funds belonging to Social Security rests squarely on the Congress.
To achieve these great national objectives, to win the war, protect the homeland, and revitalize our economy, our budget will run a deficit that will be small and short-term so long as Congress restrains spending and acts in a fiscally responsible manner.
Republican Zach Wamp of Tennessee.
His voice raised when he said that as if to say, this ball is not mine, I'm throwing it to you, and I do think these things need to be funded, but y'all have the power of the purse. Make sure you don't spend too much money, and of course everybody in Congress laughs, but that will be a struggle this year.
Democratic Senator Patty Murray of Washington.
Tonight reminded me a lot of the 1980s when we were told we could have it all. We can give everybody a tax cut. We can provide every spending that anybody wants, and that you'll never see deficits into the future. We know the reality of that.
Republicans and Democrats disagreed about the outlook for the federal budget and the economy. Larry Craig of Idaho chairs the Senate Republicans Policy Committee.
What I'm concerned about is getting people back to work. If we get people back to work, the surplus comes back. If we drag ourselves on through this recession, we look at deficits. There is no question that the economic projections show that if we're out of the recession next year, we're back into surpluses. Fiscal responsibility is important. The president laid that message down tonight. As a fiscal conservative, I'm going to be guarding that budget against frivolous spending. But tax cuts, and in some instances the right tax cuts, increase revenue by the increase of economic.
I haven't seen anything that suggests that we'll be back in a surplus situation during the next 4 to 8 years. The projections I've seen suggest that it's 2008 at the very earliest, probably 2012, and the president called to make the tax cuts permanent tonight, which would mean that you would extend it way out into the far, far distant future. I just don't see that adding up at this point.
Florida Republican Mark Foley is a career-long opponent of deficit spending.
Well, I'm concerned. I've been concerned with every president because they seem to have an endless adding machine tape that runs down the steps of the Capitol. So I want to be somewhat cognizant of the fact that we have responsibilities. We have to protect Social Security and we have to provide for Medicare. There's a lot to do under the few dollars we have available, and we can't get back into deficit spending. So we're all going to be watching. But he did admonish Congress not to open up the till and spend it on every bit of pork we can find. That's going to take some restraint. It's going to take some patience. You know, one member's pork is another member's privilege. So we're going to have to be real insightful as how we surgically remove some excess waste in the city.
Democratic leaders in charge of the Senate this week began work on a stimulus package aimed at striking a balance between Republican calls for major business tax cuts and Democrats' desire for broader unemployment benefits and health insurance for low-income workers. Last night, members of both parties agreed there still is a need for such legislation.
We're counting on some economic recovery. We hope to turn the corner. I think the economic stimulus package may not be as important today as it was 2 months ago, but I think it's still very important, and I don't think it can hurt to go ahead and go forward with it. The sooner we pull out of it, the sooner we lead the world economically again. They're relying on us. The entire world is. Our economy basically sets the markets around the world. So the sooner we come out, the sooner that deficit disappears too.
Washington State's Murray said the Homeland Defense spending the president wants also could spur the economy.
If we are rebuilding our roads and our ports and our bridges and our highways, that is not only economic security for the future and security for the future, but it is jobs right now. And those are the kinds of things I think will be good for both security and for the jobs and the economic deterioration that we're seeing.
But after the chamber-wide good feelings of last night, members of Congress said they're content to withhold final judgments on the president's budget plans until he presents them in detail next week.
The State of the Union may be strong, but what of the state of the economy? And what, if anything, should the government be doing about it? We analyze the president's answers to those questions now with Kenneth Keyes, a co-managing partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers and the former chief of staff of the Congressional Joint Tax Committee. Robert Kuttner, co-editor of The American Prospect, a liberal and progressive biweekly magazine, and Maureen Allen, chief economist at Zurich Scudder Investments, a financial management company. Kenneth Keyes, as a jumpstart, if that's what the speech was intended to do last night, as a jumpstart to the economy, how did it succeed?
Well, I think it succeeded pretty well, and that's mainly because the president has the facts on his side. If we look at just the past 12 months, the number of people unemployed jumped from 5.7 million to 8.3. We lost 1.8 million jobs in the United States. 800,000 of those were lost in the last quarter of this year. We lost 1.3 million manufacturing jobs. So when we look at that 0.2% growth rate that they just announced, no one should get too excited and feel good about that. It was largely a consequence of a big jump in government spending, a 9.3% increase. And so the economy is clearly not sound, and I think the president is sending that message, and the public opinion polls are with him. 54% of the American people are saying the economic recovery is the most important job he's got.
Mr. Kuttner, what do you say to that? Do you think that the economy is basically not strong, and what the president outlined tonight will do something about that?
Well, I think the economy is pretty feeble, but I'm not at all clear that the president's program is going to do something about it, because what he's calling economic stimulus is mostly retroactive tax cuts for corporations. Corporations invest money when they see customers. They don't invest money because of tax incentives. Almost any economist will tell you that. And the stimulus ought to be more on the spending side, less on the tax cut side. So I think while the president talks a good game when he talks about stimulus, his actual program will not do much to stimulate the economy. I also think there's a kind of Enron drag in the sense that you don't know how many other time bombs there are out there in the form of weak corporate balance sheets. And unemployment is projected to go, at least to 6.5% this year. So we do need a stimulus package, but I don't think it's the one that the president is proposing.
I want to get back to that question of the Enron drag, but first I want to ask Maureen Allen about something else we learned today, which was that the Fed decided to hold the line on interest rate cuts. And as part of the statement they put out, they said the outlook for economic recovery has become more promising. Is that a significant thing for the Fed to say?
Yes, I think it absolutely is a significant thing for the Fed to say. And I think when we're talking about a stimulus program, what we ought to look at is we've already had massive stimulus, and it has helped the economy enormously when you consider the blows that it has taken. What we shouldn't forget is any program enacted, fiscal or monetary, takes a long time to work. The Fed started to stimulate on January 3rd last year, and Bush came in with a tax cut before most people realized the economy was going to be in a recession or have any problems even. He was laughed at. They've done enormous stimulus. It's helped the economy enormously. Do we need any more? Probably not.
So are you saying that these 11 rate cuts in a row finally are paying off?
Absolutely, and just at the time you'd think they would. I mean, it always takes a year at least, and we've got a lot more in the pipeline. So, let's give cheers. The economy's feeble right now, but given what it's taken, a stock market crash, September 11th, a lot of things, it's doing amazingly well.
So, Ken Keyes, if that's true, that the economy is feeble, but that the rate cuts have finally worked, why does the Americans need a stimulus bill still?
Well, I think both of our other guests are saying what is true, which is the economy is feeble. Losing 800,000 jobs in the last quarter is not a sign that the economy is doing well. The president's proposal is a balanced package. He would increase unemployment benefits, which is important because people are going to start losing unemployment benefits, particularly those who became unemployed on 9/11, by March. But the president also has a component of packages of items to put some money into the hands of corporations, and that's where the employment is. I mean, 69% of all jobs are by corporations in the United States. They pay 75% of all wages. So the president pumping some money into the corporate side is a good thing. It'll help stave off layoffs. It'll help stave off delaying R&D, research and development. It's a positive part of the package.
So you're saying that a stimulus package, were one to pass Congress, should be top down?
It should come from both ends. We should deal with the problems of the unemployed by increasing unemployment benefits, and that creates consumption. And we should focus on the job-creating side, which is corporations. That's where jobs come from.
How about that, Mr. Kuttner? Should it be top-down, bottom-up, or any stimulus package at all?
Well, I think we do need a stimulus package. I think it should be bottom-up. The problem with the theory of corporations creating jobs in a recession because you give them tax cuts are not going to make a corporation go out and build a new factory if that corporation doesn't see customers. The other problem with the tax program that was enacted last June, the Bush tax program, almost all of that takes effect after 2004, and almost all of it takes effect on the upper brackets. So I don't know how you can possibly say that a tax cut that takes effect 2 years from now is going to do any darn good during this recession. It's fine to run deficits in a recession, but the sensible thing to do is rescind some of the tax cut and then run a moderate deficit now to get the economy out of the ditch that it's in this year.
That's what Congress should not be doing. What about what kind of legislative fixes should Congress be seeking?
Well, I think Congress should be increasing public works outlays. I would like to see Congress do emergency revenue sharing with the states. The states are facing a budget shortfall this year of $50 to $60 billion, and because the states cannot run deficits, that means that $40 to $50 billion or $50 to $60 billion is going to be taken out of the stream of state programs, and that means it's going to be taken directly out of the stream of commerce. It would be smart if Congress took some of that money that's going to be spent on tax cuts for the wealthy years from now and spend that on revenue sharing for the states this year.
Maureen Allen, as Bob Kuttner points out correctly, states cannot run deficits, but the federal government certainly can. Should this new deficit spending be factored into any kind of idea about how a recovery will occur and whether it will really take root?
Well, you know, a lot of the deficit spending is sort of automatic. I mean, I think it's appropriate that we're spending Homeland Security, it's appropriate that we're spending defense, and those are stimulative. There's already a lot of automatic stabilizers. You know, a lot of those wealthy people won't be paying many taxes because they won't have much income with what's going on in the stock market here, so they're going to, you know, if you call that a tax break. But I think what the government really needs to do is look after the things it can do well, which is defense and Homeland Security. Taxes had crept up a lot. Bush's tax cut was to sort of redress some of those prior tax increases. But let's face it, a stimulus package that's enacted now won't get working until 2003 at the earliest. And by then, by the way the economy's looking, I don't think we're going to need it.
May I differ with that? If Congress passed a $60 billion revenue sharing package, that would take effect instantly because that would mean that the states would not have to do $60 billion worth of spending cuts. So it is possible to design a stimulus package that takes effect this week.
You can't pass it this week.
Okay, well, I want to move on and pick up on a point that Maureen Allen made, which is that there is a lot of money being spent on defense and on homeland defense. $30 million a day on the war, the president said last night. Whose job is it to hold down spending, as the president also said that the Congress should be doing?
Well, I think it's both the job of the Congress and the president. Together, they've got to make the best judgment for the American people about what are the demands that we face as a nation. And these are tough questions, but it's going to have to be them jointly. None of these are going to be easy to deal with, but I think it's wrong to think that an economic stimulus package couldn't take effect immediately. If it was enacted by the Easter recess, it could be effective January 1 of this year. That means it would immediately impact the economy and could immediately impact the creation of jobs and help people who are unemployed. So I think we really need to focus on what we can do now.
While we're talking about deficit spending, let me just run down for you some of the things the president called for last night without necessarily specifying how they would be paid for. Extended unemployment benefits, Head Start, HMO and Medicare reform, prescription drug benefits for seniors, and doubling the budget for the Peace Corps and for Homeland Defense. How do you do all that in this kind of an economy?
Well, the president's going to do it when he presents his budget on February 4th. He's going to run a deficit, and they've made a judgment that in this economy, running a deficit is probably a good thing. So it can be done. I mean, we're going to have to borrow, but short-term borrowing to get our economic growth rate back up is a good-term, long-term investment. Mr. Kuttner said we could take the tax cuts from 2004 and spend them now. I don't know how we do that. Those are in 2004. What we need to do now is focus on what we can actually do to get the economy going, because if we get the GDP growth rate up, revenues will pick up. But don't lose sight of this fact. Federal revenues as a percent of GDP right now over the next 10 years are projected to be at the highest levels in the history of the country, almost 20%. So taxes in the United States are high, even with the tax cut that occurred last spring.
Mr. Kuttner, your response?
Well, the way you take money that was going to be given away in tax cuts in 2004 and spend it now is to do what the president did. You look at the 10-year projection of surplus money and deficit money. You give away less of it in taxes 2 years from now, and you spend more of it now to get the money out of recession, get the economy out of recession. It's perfectly okay to run a deficit during recession. Both parties used to believe that. One of the most bizarre turns of events in the past few years is that the Democrats have become the party that believe, almost as a matter of religious faith, some of them, that you should never run a deficit. It used to be that everybody felt correctly that it's appropriate to run a deficit during a recession. It's odd that it's the Republicans now who are carrying that banner.
Maureen Allen, I don't want to stray too far from a point that Bob Kuttner brought up earlier, which is about the Enron effect. Is there an Enron effect, especially affecting investor confidence?
Absolutely there is. I work in the financial markets, and we see an enormous skittishness out there. Anytime an executive leaves unexpectedly or one probes to a little bit of an off-balance sheet organization, I mean, people are running scared. And I think that's going to be a little bit harder to cure because there have been, let's face it, some real excesses in the financial markets. It always happens when you have a time of great exuberance. And that's going to take a while to clean up. So I don't think we're going to have a really exuberant stock market to bail us out of here anytime soon.
Ken Keyes, an Enron effect?
I think there's going to be a minor Enron effect. I mean, I think Enron is, for the most part, a unique situation, terrible tragedy. I hope the one thing Congress doesn't do is overreact to it and enact a bunch of legislation to deal with a problem that doesn't really exist.
How about that, Mr. Kuttner?
Well, I don't think it's a unique situation. I don't think it's a tragedy. I think it's an example of deliberate malfeasance. It's an example of conservatives lobbying to prevent the Securities and Exchange Commission from doing its job. And as these regulations forcing corporations to keep honest books have been loosened, some of the biggest names in the American economy, Citicorp, Anderson, or Citigroup, are implicated in this, and I think investors correctly perceive that you are going to see more Enrons, and that needs to be reformed big time. And in the meantime, investors are going to be skittish, and that's going to be one more drag on the economy.
Another question to you. The president said pretty bluntly last night, we are at war, we are in recession. If these two are indeed linked, how long is this recession going to last? Mr. Kuttner.
Well, I think this will be a slightly worse than usual recession because you've got three factors that aren't typical. You've got September 11th, you've got the dot-com meltdown in general, the unwinding of all that excessive exuberance from the 1990s, and then on top of it you've got Enron, which leads investors to be more skeptical than usual about corporate balance sheets. So I think you take those three things together, it's probably going to be a slightly worse than usual recession if we're lucky and if we have the appropriate public policies to get ourselves out of it.
Mr. Keyes.
I think I agree with Mr. Kuttner. The key is what are the right policies, and I think what the president's laid out is the right balance. We need to increase unemployment benefits, but we've got to focus on the job-creating side. People want their unemployment benefits increased, but what they really want is they want their jobs back, and that's where we've got to focus some effort on the job creation side of the equation.
And Ms. Allen, how long?
Well, I think the recession is very close to over. Again, I'm just looking at the massive monetary stimulus we've had and really the massive fiscal stimulus we've already had. And I think we're kind of coming to a stabilization and probably even beginning growth this month or next if we didn't begin it last year. But whether it'll be a fast recovery, I think it's going to feel very uncomfortable, just like it did coming out of 90-91.
All right, Ms. Allen, Mr. Kuttner, and Mr. Keyes, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come. come on the NewsHour tonight, a warning about states that harbor terrorism and a Roger Rosenblatt essay. Ray Suarez has the terrorism story.
As the Afghan campaign is wound down, the U.S. has expanded its war on terror by sending advisors and special forces to the Philippines, by increasing its military surveillance in Somalia, and reportedly training special forces on the ground in Yemen. But last night, the president suggested an even broader scope. He cited additional countries, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, saying their true nature is to sponsor terror.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate, yet time is not on our side. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. Our war on terror has well begun, but it has only begun.
The three countries responded quickly. In Baghdad, the vice president spoke to reporters.
The statement made by Bush is stupid, and it is improper for the president of a superpower to judge a state through imagination or estimation, and to do so at a time when countries are creating chaos and instability in the world. In the forefront is the administration that he represents.
In Pyongyang, the government of leader Kim Jong-il issued a statement. The Bush speech, it said, is sophism intended to justify its military presence in South Korea and persistently pursue its policy of aggression against the DPRK, the acronym for North Korea. And in Tehran, former President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, now an advisor to the country's leading clerics, called the charges baseless. He said the American people, like members of the Congress, may applaud Bush and chant hooray for him, but we will not be intimidated by this pompous rhetoric. If the president decides to attack the countries he mentioned, the Senate's lead Democrat said Congress would endorse him.
I think that there's a very strong belief that we've got to do whatever is necessary to prevent the kind of attacks that we saw last fall. And if it takes preemptive strikes, it takes preemptive action, I think the Congress is prepared to support it.
This afternoon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was asked if the military has the resources to fight terror on multiple fronts around the world.
In life, one makes choices. And if we decide to initiate things, we'll initiate things, and in a manner and in time and with the choices that fit us. If the world decides to impose choices on us, then we'll make choices with respect to the things we're doing and deal with those problems.
I would only add, I agree with the Secretary that when we're called upon by the President to do whatever, we'll be ready to do that.
One reporter told Rumsfeld the President's remarks were interpreted as a widening of the war.
Wow. First you have characterized how the world is interpreting it. And I don't know how the world's interpreting it. He just uttered those words last evening. Those are all countries that I have spoken about repeatedly, the President has spoken about repeatedly. They are countries that have records of fostering terrorist activity. What the president was saying to the world, and properly so, was these circumstances that exist in the world today are distinctly different than in earlier eras, and they need to be noted, and the world has to understand the potential for not thousands of people to be killed, but for tens of thousands of people to be killed.
But is military action imminent? That's the real thing. He was suggesting it would be military action as opposed to something else.
He said exactly what he said. He said it well. He didn't suggest anything. If there was anything about last night's speech, it was that it had near perfect clarity. I think if I were in Iran, or North Korea, or Iraq, and I heard the President of the United States say what he said last night about weapons of mass destruction, and about terrorism, and about terrorist networks, and about nations that harbor terrorists, I don't think there'd be a lot of ambiguity.
Rumsfeld said the Pentagon is asking for a bigger budget to prepare for surprises that he says surely will happen again. For more on President Bush's approach to fighting terrorism as laid out in his State of the Union address, we get two perspectives. James Woolsey was director of the CIA during the first Clinton administration and an arms control negotiator during the first Bush administration. And Charles William Maines was an assistant secretary of state during the Carter administration and is now president of the Eurasia Foundation, a nonprofit group promoting free markets and democracy in Central Asia. James Woolsey, let me start with you to follow on from Secretary Rumsfeld. He speculated about how this was being heard in Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Is it a general statement of American attitudes or a real policy prescription?
It's probably somewhere in between. It's very definitely a clear statement of the president's attitude, and it leans, it seems to me, toward a policy of telling these governments that if they do not get out of the business of terror and developing weapons of mass destruction, they stand at risk of their regimes being deposed forcefully by the United States. And the president's been very careful. He didn't precisely say that he's going to launch military action in order to remove, say, Saddam's regime. But he certainly gave Saddam particularly, I think, and the other two leaders as well, a great cause for concern. I very much hope he did anyway.
Bill Maine, same question.
Well, I think the White House put out a statement this afternoon saying that there was no prospect of immediate military action. We were open to talks with Iran and North Korea, and that the statement that we had an axis of evil was more rhetorical than historical, because I think that phrase immediately triggered in many people's mind Nazi Germany. So already the White House, I think, has set the priorities clear for the United States. The main priority is going after the tens of thousands of people the president talked about who are in between 12 and 60 countries and are possible terrorists who may do the kind of damage that we saw in New York. And that is the first priority. I think the administration's quite clear on it, as was revealed, I think, by the Secretary of Defense statement and now this statement that has come out of the White House.
But apart from the axis of evil statement, the president went on and said, America will do what is necessary, and then brought that point home. Time is not on our side. He created the sense of urgency. Oblige the United States to begin moving against these countries?
The president said in his speech there are tens of thousands of people in place ready to carry out terrorist activities. The White House has released a statement saying there may be 100,000 people around the world who are terrorists ready to carry out actions against the United States or its allies. If that's the reality, then time is not on our side in terms of getting every one of those. And we have to engage in an absolutely vigorous effort with our allies and with friends and people who formerly were our enemies to try to find those people, because they are like the pirates of 2 centuries ago. They are a menace to every civilized country, and the president is right to say that that is the priority.
Jim Woolsey, give us an idea of when a president announces a policy like this or makes a statement of principle like this, What's going on behind the scenes? Is the heat turned up in Central Intelligence where you worked, at the heads of services, as they begin to look at the map of the world and figure out what's where and what can be done?
Well, I think it's no secret that there seems to have been a debate within the administration between those who would have delayed action against, say, Iraq for a long time, and the argument being you need to clean up absolutely everything else first, and various other arguments, and those who believe, as I think the President said, time is not on our side with respect to weapons of mass destruction and terror sponsored by, in the terror case, at least 2 of these 3 states, and we may need to move more promptly. I don't see that there's only one problem here. It's not just the tens of thousands or 10,000 or whatever they are, Al-Qaeda members out in dozens of countries. We need to move on those with our allies and others. But that doesn't mean that we can take life easy with respect to the threats that are continually posed by Saddam's regime in particular. I think that it's important for us to make preparations with countries in the area, particularly Turkey, with the movement of U.S. forces into the region, stockpiling smart weapons, doing those things that we would need to do if the President decides to move particularly against Iraq.
Bill Maines, by lumping these 3 countries together into an axis of evil, rhetorical or otherwise, do you lose some of the daylight in between them? Are they different from each other, and would they respond to different approaches when you finally get down to moving against what the American government finds offensive about these regimes?
Well, already, because Iran and Iraq feel that they might be in the crosshairs, they are getting closer together. There's been a visit by the Iraqi foreign minister. Both sides have shut down the activities of the resistance groups inside each country that was acting against the other. They've begun to exchange some prisoners of war. There is a warming in the relationship. I suspect that if they feel they really are in danger of imminent attack, that will be even greater. I think one of the problems of waging a war against Iraq in the foreseeable future, it's not an ethical question, it's a prudential question. The Chief of Staff of Turkey has spoken out against it. The head of intelligence in Saudi Arabia has spoken out against it. And the reason is that very few people in the region believe that this is a policy that would serve their interests. And that is something that the United States, if it wants to do this, is going to have to turn around.
James Woolsey, America pushing Iraq and Iran into each other's arms?
I think those trends are relatively superficial. I think at the terrorist end of the spectrum, Iraq and Iran and Sudan and Al-Qaeda, a number of these countries have been cooperating off and on for some time. I think the important thing is that there is a difference between these countries. North Korea doesn't really any longer, although it once did, pose a terrorist threat. It poses a weapons of mass destruction threat. Iran is a country where there is some hope because of its constitution, because of brave newspaper editors and reformists, because of massive student demonstrations against the mullahs. There's a possibility that with perhaps a shove here and there, Iran might turn away from the Waliat al-Faqih, the mullahs that run the power instruments of the state. The point is that with respect to Iraq, there's no hope. Iraq is like Nazi Germany. It is not going to throw up an Iraqi Gorbachev. The Ba'athist system is a system essentially of government by torture and murder and rape. And the poor Iraqi people have been governed this way for decades. I think we would be more popular, couldn't be more popular anywhere in the world than we would be in the streets of Baghdad if we deposed the Iraqi regime, just as we have become very popular in the streets of Kabul.
Well, what about Bill Maines' other point, which is that very few people in the neighborhood seem to be ready to stand behind the United States if it moves in that direction?
Well, I think that Turkey would be able to be persuaded if we give it the right incentives, and it is the country, I would admit, that we need. But most of the other countries, and after all, outside Israel and Turkey, that Mideast is populated mainly by vulnerable autocrats and pathological predators. And the vulnerable autocrats express fear of the pathological predators, and they say, oh, please don't mess with Saddam. Listen to us, Saddam. Hear us say this. We're telling the Americans not to mess with you. But if we succeed, and I think if we decided to do it, we would succeed, in deposing the Iraqi regime and bringing a far more decent regime and government system to power in Iraq, throughout the Mideast and especially in Iraq itself, we would be among the most popular people in the world.
Well, what happened with Iran? You heard Jim Woolsey allude to it a moment ago, that there was what was being seen both among our allies and in American foreign policy circles as a lot of forward movement. Cooperation early on in the war in Afghanistan.
I mean, they've had several elections. What Jim says is true, that there has been an evolution in public attitudes, and in fact, if you did not have a small group of mullahs who are basically dictating to the government at any key moment that they can't move in the direction that I think the Iranian people want to move, we would have seen a real change. But I think that Jim trivializes the problems that are involved in trying to deal with Iraq. It's divided into three groups. You've got Kurds in the north, you've got Shia in the south. The Saudis are very worried that if you did attack Iraq, that the Shia would join up with Iran. The oil section of Saudi Arabia is basically Shiite. They're very worried about that section. The Turks are worried about what kind of regime would emerge if the Kurds in northern Iraq did get some kind of independence, because they've got a large Kurdish population that they've been repressing for a long time. So there are lots of problems here, and it seems to me many of the people who are calling for this invasion are like throwing a rock up the mountain and hoping the avalanche hits the other side. But the people in the area are worried the avalanche is going to hit them. And until we've got them on our side, I think this is not a policy that's going to go anywhere.
James Woolsey?
The people in the area are sort of like small businessmen in Chicago in 1929 paying protection money to Al Capone. If Eliot Ness and his fellow G-men had showed up in Chicago and said, gee, we don't know what we want to do. What do you think? Should we do anything with Al Capone? They would have heard, oh, no, Al Capone, he's a great guy. Let's not disturb things. But if it's clear that the U.S. government is going to take action and remove Saddam Hussein's regime, you will find, I think, a lot of support pulling behind us, and the support that we need will be there. We don't need lots and lots of allies on this. We don't need the French, for example. If they want to criticize because they have business interests with Saddam, let them criticize. But we do need the Turks, and I think that with the Turks and the Kuwaitis, who I believe would be with us, and the kind of air power that we demonstrated in Afghanistan with 80% smart weapons, a revolutionary change in air power, together with some indigenous forces on the ground, but perhaps several divisions of U.S. troops. This might well be something that would take more U.S. forces, substantially more than Afghanistan, but I don't think it would take the 500,000 that we deployed in the Gulf War. I think we have an excellent chance of changing the whole face of the Mideast and removing a major threat to the United States. I don't say that this needs to happen right away, or it shouldn't be done without preparation. Of course, we should negotiate, prepare, work with the countries in the region as much as possible. But decisiveness on America's part brings support.
Are we preparing for a wider war?
I would just point out that after World War I, when the British tried to reconquer many of their colonies which had become independent or semi-independent, the one place in the world they found it hardest to reconquer was Iraq. They found it actually impossible. They finally imported back into the country 500 officers from the Ottoman army who had come from Baghdad families, and they carried out the bitter repression that united the country. Basically, you've had the same system ever since. It is extremely unfortunate, but if we're going to go down this road, then I think we have to redraw the map of the Middle East. And we are going to, I think, going to be talking about an independent Kurdistan, and we're going to be talking about big developments with Iran and the Shiite population.
I completely disagree with that. We do not want to have an independent Kurdistan. I think we can guarantee to the Turks that there would not be. That's an important feature, and I think Bill is quite wrong about the Shia in southern Iraq wanting to join Iran. I don't think that would occur and most of the scholars I know who are experts in the area, such as Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami, do not believe that that would happen either.
The head of intelligence of the Saudi government believes it would take place.
Special pleader.
Yeah.
Charles William Maines, James Woolsey, thank you both, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Finally, tonight, we've had some technical problems with Richard Rodriguez's essay, and we'll have to reschedule it. Instead, essayist Roger Rosenblatt has some thoughts about censorship.
Watching Cinema Paradiso for the billionth time recently, that heartbreakingly beautiful movie of 1988, I was reminded that so much of censorship lately has focused on the things we find offensive, but wish to protect nonetheless. The uproars in New York City in the past year or so when Mayor Rudolph Giuliani attempted to suppress works of art in the Brooklyn Museum that clearly were offensive to a great many people. And there have been lots of attempts at censoring demonstrations and individuals. Mohammed Abdul Rauf, the NBA basketball player who was threatened with suspension because he refused to stand for the playing of the national anthem at the beginning of games. The groups that protested the rights of the Ku Klux Klan to march in Harlem, an issue that recalled the one in Illinois some years ago when the American Nazi Party marched. And, of course, the ever-present flag-burning issue raised most recently when a bill to prohibit flag burning was passed by the House of Representatives. All such events serve to reinforce the value of the First Amendment for the very reason that they, in fact, are displeasing or insulting or enraging, often to vast segments of the population. The First Amendment allows us to protect the expression of those things we cannot stand. In art, this is because one man's pornography is another man's or woman's work of genius. One man's Ulysses is another man's Ulysses. Nude descending a staircase may descend too far. To some, the moon is gold. To others, the moon is blue. All this is fairly obvious stuff. What's less obvious about the unacceptability of censorship is brought out in the movie Cinema Paradiso. If you forget the story, here it is. The Cinema Paradiso is the only movie in this small, suffocating Sicilian village. To the theater comes Toto, a small boy, to visit his friend Alfredo, and their friendship is forged over movies. To the theater also comes a priest, the local priest, who expurgates the love scenes from the movies. These love scenes consist mainly of kissing scenes. Alfredo takes the strips of film and hangs them in the projectionist booth. Toto grows up, Alfredo goes blind, Toto takes over Alfredo's job. Toto eventually falls in love, but the love of his life leaves that suffocating village, and Alfredo says to Toto, "You leave too. You leave or you will never find your life in so narrow-minded a place." Toto only returns as a grown man, rich and powerful now. He returns for Alfredo's funeral. He sees that the Cinema Paradiso has been shut down and is ready for demolition. His mother then gives him a gift that Alfredo left for him. It is a movie reel, which he plays for himself in his own theater in Rome. 6, 5, 4, the numbers wind down. And there on the reel are all the expurgated scenes from the movies of his childhood. All the censored kisses, all the censored passion, all the censored life. And the man rests his head in his arms behind him, and he smiles and cries and smiles again. Cinema Paradiso is a work of art, not of politics, but it is undergirded by a political thought. What if nobody had taken out any of those love scenes? What if the people who discovered a little freedom in the movies had been encouraged to know the full range of their feelings? The essential thing that censorship removes is a sense of possibility, the art of possibility. Censor possibility here in America, and you have another country. I'm Roger Rosenblatt.
Again, the major developments of the day. President Bush took his State of the Union message to North Carolina. He challenged Congress to pass an economic stimulus plan. The Federal Reserve left the key interest rate unchanged, and a White House spokesman played down any talk of imminent military strikes against Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. I'm Gwen Eiffel. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by...
Imagine a world where no child begs for food. While some will look on that as a dream, others will look long and hard and get to work. ADM, the nature of what's to come.
And by SBC Communications. In the last year alone, SBC employees volunteered more than 6 million hours, which means even when we're not working to improve communications, we're doing something to help improve communities. SBC Communications.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This program was also made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Discover the effect on a family of one man's return. Experience American Family, next on Wisconsin Public Television.
Video cassettes of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.